My name is Teresa Lewis. I'm a senior consultant on the Advanced Measurement Services team for Adobe Advertising Cloud. And for those of you that are not familiar, the Advertising Cloud is the DSP for Adobe. And in my role, I focus on measurement. So I help develop solutions that help advertisers better measure and optimize their ad spend towards business objectives that they care about. And a part of that is making sure that your ads are working and adding incremental impact and value for your brand. And that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to be taking you through first some challenges that exist in correlated based measurement that lift testing will help you address. And then we'll go through some best practices and some tips that you can take with you as you embrace lift testing within your organizations. And then I'm going to close today's session with an example and a case study. Now, before I start today's session and the discussion here, let's take a moment and think about, why do we advertise? We advertise to change behavior. And that behavior can vary depending on your brand, your vertical, and where you are in the marketplace. And it can range everything from getting a customer to buy your product for the first time, to getting your existing customers to buy more, to having them take an action on a website, such as filling out an application. And the list goes on and on, right? But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our ad spend is actually causing that change in behavior. And measurement is what we use to say, did we do a good job? Did our ads actually work at changing that behavior? And then we refine that and we try to look at what parts of our ad spend actually work the hardest for us, and we optimize to try to make it more efficient and try to work harder as we go. But understanding if our ads actually cause the change in behavior is pretty tricky. It's not as simple as it sounds. And the reason for that is really because a lot of the measurement solutions that we use and the tools that we have available in digital are based on correlation. So we serve ads to people, and they go purchase. In correlated measurement, we take credit for that purchase. But really, we don't know if that person was just going to purchase anyway, or if our ads actually caused that change in behavior. And I'm not saying that correlated measurement is all bad. We use correlation all the time in digital marketing and also in our everyday lives. I'll say that, when it's a nice day out, unlike today, I know if I want to go to my favorite restaurant and sit out on the patio, it's going to be pretty busy, and there'll probably be a wait. And I would say 9.9 times out of 10, me correlating nice weather and having to wait and the patio being busy are directly related, and it's a safe bet. Same thing with digital, reeling it back to advertising here. We use metrics like viewability percentage. We associate someone seeing our ad and it being in view for a moment in time with it being able to have an impact. And a lot of these metrics can be very useful. But what's important to know is that correlation does not equal causation. And in performance advertising and measurement, we've used correlation forever almost. And really, it's not because it's what's best, but it's really because of what's readily available. And in digital, we have these certain pieces to where we can pull levers and see things in real time, to where that's really the best that we've had. But the truth is, you can enhance that and make it better and more powerful for you. And there are a lot of ways that we really improved upon this by moving from last touch attribution to multi-touch attribution, which in that case, we're still just taking that assumed credit and redistributing it more fairly across our ad execution. It's not proving causality. So as advertisers, how do we really address this and these challenges that exist? We're going to talk more about that today, but first I want to dive into these challenges a little bit further. There are two main biases that we see exist when it comes to correlated based measurement. One is audience bias. On average, brands have typically 3 or more types of customers that they're going after. And we'll start here: loyalists, people that are shopping around, and then your competitors' loyalists. And each one of these type of customers have a different likelihood to purchase your product. And they range from your loyalists, we know that they have the highest likelihood. Most of them are going to buy your brand because they're already loyal. You may not even need to advertise to them in the first place. Then you have those people that are in the middle group, which maybe sometimes they buy your product, Maybe sometimes they buy your competitors. Maybe they're just entering the market. And then you have your competitors' loyalists, which are going to have the lowest likelihood to purchase your brand because they're already loyal to the competition. And I would say if we're really trying to get our ads to work and change behavior, most of the time we're trying to focus our efforts on those that are in that winnable group and our competitors' loyalists to try to snag some of their market share. However, if you're basing this on correlation and measuring using typically a CPA, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle because those that are going to look more efficient on that type of model will be the people that have already made up their minds and are likely to buy your product. They'll always show up more efficient. And then there's low rate bias. And when you think about the cost of media, I think we touched on this earlier today in an earlier session, if you lower the cost of your media, you're able to deliver more impressions. But as the cost of your media goes up, the amount you're able to deliver goes down. So if you think about it, if I'm cutting the cost of my media in half and doubling up on what I'm delivering, what I'm going to be able to do is get in front of more individuals that were likely to take action anyway and take credit for that. So I'll be able to take more credit for total actions that occurred, increasing my conversion rate and lowering and reducing my cost per action. So let's look at these challenges and how it really unfolds when we think about performance optimization. I'm going to show you guys two tactics here, tactic A and tactic B. And we're going to go through an exercise here. And my main business objective is to get new buyers to purchase my product with my ads. And to keep it simple, we'll start out with the same level of spend here for each tactic. We deliver our ads. Now let's take a look at what buyers I attributed to my ads. You can see here that tactic A has a higher volume. Then we tie that back to costs using that traditional KPI that many of us use of cost per action. And we'll see that tactic A is also a lot more efficient here than tactic B. In traditional performance optimization, a lot of us would optimize our spend towards tactic A, potentially even cut tactic B altogether. But now let's take a look and see if we were able to remove those customers that were going to purchase anyway and that were not impacted by our ads, and look at the incremental buyers. You'll see that tactic A barely worked at all. A lot of those people were going to purchase anyway, whereas tactic B really worked the hardest for us. Then we tie that back to cost with a new metric of cost per incremental action. And tactic B is actually very much so more efficient than tactic A at doing what we're trying to get it to do in the first place, is get more buyers to purchase. So as you guys can see, this can be really problematic if you're optimizing all your ad spend this way, because there can be a lot of conflict. A lot of our correlated-based metrics are completely inverse with what we're trying to do in the first place. So the way that you approach this is with lift testing, and we'll get into the details there here in a second. But as you approach this from an organizational standpoint and start supporting, exploring incrementality, it's very important to know the difference here and how this can unfold. Some of those tactics and audiences that are just killing it and doing awesome on a cost per action basis might actually not be driving any incremental value. So you have to be prepared that as you do this type of measurement, that might reveal itself. In addition, you see here that inverse relationship and how much more expensive tactic B was. So you can't rely on historic benchmarks of cost per action when you're doing incrementality testing. So those are some first steps that you want to take as an organization when you start doing lift testing to really understand that you're going to have to define success in a different way. So let's look at the bigger picture here. We spend a lot of money on ads. In 2018, global digital ad spend was approaching $300 billion. That's a lot, right? And we know that our ads work to some degree, or we wouldn't be spending money there in the first place. And we can see this unfold with how our growth happens as with our brand. But just imagine if you can get just a small portion or fraction of your ad dollars to work that much harder for you because you were able to have better visibility into what was actually working. It can be very powerful to get you a larger amount of return. So how do we do this as advertisers? We need to start lifting. And I don't mean hitting up the gym, while that serves its own purpose, but start embracing lift testing and folding that into your measurement framework and moving beyond those traditional correlated-based measurement. Lift testing is not a new concept. It's been around for decades in the pharmaceutical industry. The best way to test out a new drug is to take a group, and really the gold standard, is to take a group of people and give half of them the drug, and then they give the other half a placebo pill, which is really a sugar pill. And then the researchers are able to see what those people that got the sugar pill did and use that as a baseline of what would occur anyway to understand the effectiveness of that drug. In advertising, when we're doing lift tests, same concept here applies. But we're not dishing out sugar pills to anybody. But instead, we're developing a control group and serving a group of people a placebo ad to understand what would happen had I not advertised, to really understand what is going on with our ads. So that control group, again, is really going to provide a North Star for us. We'll be able to take a look at, out of those people that converted, who would have converted anyway, so we can isolate that true lift driven by our ad campaign. And this is something that technology has helped us along the way to be able to conduct lift tests, but it's not very simple or easy. So I'm going to take you through some best practices that you can take with you of how to start thinking about measuring incrementality and running and conducting lift tests. So first, we're going to take us all back to science class here. Something that you want to do is define your goal. And you want to make sure that you are isolating your one independent and dependent variable. A common pitfall I see is that advertisers want to test way too many things at once. And it's just the nature of digital. We have all these different levers that we can pull. And really, at the end of the day, if you do that, your results will come back and they'll be as clear as mud. So you want to make sure that you're able to isolate one thing that you're trying to test in order to get clean and clear results. And let me give you an example of this for those of you that are trying to think of what is the independent or dependent variable in advertising. So first, the learning objective here, will delivering my ads to my lapsed customers cause them to purchase? That's my objective. My independent variable is that ad treatment. That's what I have control over. So would actually delivering them the ad, which is the independent variable, influence purchase, which is the dependent variable. The dependent variable you can think of as your KPI and what you're trying to accomplish. It's not what you can control. What you're controlling is that independent variable. Let's look at that in the form of a lift test here. So for the exposed audience, you'll take those lapsed customers or a group of them, and you'll be treating them with your ad. They're exposed to your ad, and then we'll monitor that behavior, so that purchase rate. And then for your control group, which is going to be another portion of those lapsed customers that did not see your ad, but instead they were served a PSA ad that has nothing to do with your brand, and we're able to measure that behavior. So this bottom part here, that control group, is going to serve as our baseline for us to understand what would happen if we just don't serve ads, to measure the true lift driven by advertising. And the next step of this is making sure before you start running a lift test, understand if it's feasible and what sample size you'll need to hit statistical significance. Another pitfall is people dive into lift testing and then they pick a percentage of placebos that they want to deliver in the mix without doing any type of sample sizing before they run their experiment. And then they don't get statistically significant results. And if you don't have statistical significance, those results are not going to be meaningful and you're not going to be able to action off them. So the way that you can do this is first doing some benchmarking and a listening, peering, and understanding your baseline behavior that's happening. So if this is an action on your website, you could even start to use some historical data to do this analysis beforehand. And then you're going to do an estimate of sample sizes that you'll need, both from your exposed and your control standpoint. This is also when you'd probably bring in somebody off of your team that has a title of data scientist. Or you can lever a partner like Adobe, and we help our partners out with that. But I do want to touch on a few things that you can take with you as you think about sample sizing, even if you don't have the title of a data scientist. that are helpful to think about. So as your conversion rate goes up, so that dependent variable that we'd be measuring, your sample size needed goes down. So if I'm a well-known e-com brand and I'm trying to measure someone going to my website, I'll probably need a smaller sample size than if I was a mortgage company and trying to get somebody to apply for a mortgage, because that event doesn't happen very often. So I'd need a larger sample. And as lift goes up, the sample size you needed goes down. So my ads work really well. I'll need a smaller sample size to hit statistical significance to say, yes, it worked. And this kind of relays back into the other example here, but if I don't see a high degree of change, which could happen if your event doesn't happen very often, you'll need a bigger sample set. And lastly, something to consider is as your exposed ratio goes up, your sample size as needed goes up. And what I mean by that is if you want to spend less on placebo ads, you're going to need a bigger sample. So the closer you can get to a 1-to-1 ratio or 50-50 split, the smaller sample size you'll need. So along with understanding and defining what you're trying to accomplish and making sure that you're having the right size samples, the way that you conduct a lift test and the randomization that's at play when you start to partition your audiences into a control and exposed group, that randomization is key. If you don't have randomization, your test is not really going to be valid because your control group won't really serve as a proper baseline if it's not representative. These two boxes here represent the same in-market audience. And I think everyone in the room can say that with an in-market audience and data segment, there's a lot of other pockets within that. And to keep it simple here, the blue dots represent my brand's loyalists, and the green dots are representing my competitors' loyalists. And this box right here is a non-randomized sample of this audience, and this one's randomized, okay? So if we start to think about this and how this can affect your lift test, let's look at the control group here of the non-randomized sample. You can see here that it is really comprised of my brand's loyalists, whereas the randomized sample has a nice distribution. Flipping that to my exposed, that includes a lot of my competitors' loyalists. So at the end of the day, if I'm going to be running a lift test and trying to use that non-randomized sample over here, it's really not going to be effective because my control group is absolutely not representing my exposed. And really what you want to make sure you're doing is having both these groups represent each other, so the only difference is that your exposed group is getting treated with your ad, so you can measure that impact. Now there's ways that you can test this out. The easiest way is to take both those groups and see what their behavior is on things that are completely unrelated to the advertiser that you're testing for. And here's an example of that data set that we use. So at Adobe, we have a tool called Experiment Designer that's built within the Ad Cloud buying platform. And this is a sample set of data here of a control and exposed group. And what we did to test this out is we looked at the behavior of these two groups across a retailer, a home supply store where a purchase doesn't happen very often, a QSR restaurant, and then we looked and seeing what percent were women within each of these audiences. And if you have good randomization at play, you should see no statistical difference at all between the two. And that's really a way to prove if that randomization is working. And as you start to run lift tests yourself, I would really recommend taking this type of approach. And if you're working with a technology partner, making sure that they have these type of data points that can really show you what the methodology is. Now, we've talked about how we really define our goals, setting ourselves up for success with making sure we have large enough samples and randomization. And we've talked a lot about science concepts today, which are all very, very important. Lift testing allows you to really run sophisticated ad research, but we also need to make sure that we're recognizing that we're running an ad campaign and that you want this research to be relevant to how you'd actually run your ad campaign had you not be running a test. So it's important to try to keep it in an environment that is pretty similar to how you'd run your ad campaign normally. A pitfall I see is that advertisers try to isolate that independent variable so much that it almost becomes this completely contained experiment that really isn't representative of what would happen if they were just running an ad campaign at all. So those results won't be as actionable. An example of that would be, we think about other media running outside of our tests. If I have things running video or audio ads and so on, and trying to isolate just one pocket of this test, it's really not as effective, because if you have true randomization at play with your control and exposed audience, they're both going to be equally affected, so it's not going to contaminate your results. Another thing is, and I'm getting in the weeds a little bit here, but if you are in a biddable environment and use dynamic bidding, which is really beneficial to try to be efficient, you don't want to flip that to flat bidding just because you're running a lift test. But you do want to make sure that your control and your exposed get treated equally the entire time. So we've talked through all the steps in running a lift test. What do you do once you get the results? And how do you action off of it? It's not like performance measurement. Performance measurement feeds into a bidder, and we're able to optimize these results in real time. But when running a lift test and looking at incrementality, it's to answer bigger questions in advertising, to understand and answer what's really working within an ad campaign and causality. So then you can take what you learned and fold that into your media buying best practices and make all of your media work harder for you overall to have a better impact on your overall ROI, right? So you can take things like, if I find out a specific audience or tactic is not providing incremental value for my brand, start to shift dollars away. So I'm spending my dollars where it matters most. And then it's important to continue to build off that, and not just do one test, but then test other variables to continue to fine-tune those buying best practices so your dollars work as hard as possible. So to end today's session, I want to walk through an example of this. I'm going to take you through a case study for Redbox. How many of you guys are familiar with Redbox? Okay. Redbox is a traditional DR-focused advertiser. So they look at metrics like cost per action and return on ad spend. But they wanted to really start fine-tuning the way that they're running ads, because they're running into the market with these big giants, streaming giants like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon, to where they need to make sure that any money that they're spending on advertising is actually doing something, and it's not going to waste, so they can continue to build efficiencies. They first wanted to learn if display advertising worked. Did that actually have an incremental impact for the brand? But then they also wanted to examine two different audiences. One was their lapsed customers that had not purchased or rented a movie online in quite some time, and then some active customers that bounced from the cart. The way they did this was they delivered placebo ads to a portion of both of those audiences, so a charity ad, and then they delivered their actual ad to another portion of those two audiences to understand the lift between the two. And this was done using the software solution within Adobe Advertising Cloud called Experiment Designer. And what this does, it allows you to really create those control and expose groups within the buying platform. And it does randomization at the ad call. So it splits those two groups, completely randomized, to keep two clean sample groups of control and exposed. And the results are in real time within the platform, so they're able to really see these results and know when they can action off them and really take those learnings and fold them into their best practice. So let's look at some data. Now, the first thing that we learned, first and foremost, is that a lot of these actions would happen anyway, which is indicated here with the red bars, which is the placebo and the conversion rate of the placebo across both those two audiences. But what was great and good news was that the exposed audience converted at a higher rate. So we could first say that our advertising with display caused change in behavior. And the Cart Abandoners 2 audience provided a lot higher incremental impact for the brand. So what they did in this point was really optimize, and they completely cut and nixed that first Cart Abandoner audience. They were able to take a learning that advertising to their lapsed customers really didn't provide as much of an incremental impact and benefit for their brand as targeting somebody that's recently bounced from the cart. And what they did with this was they really built this into their test and learn framework for 2019. They used that as a learning point, but then now they're using this to validate other tactics and audiences as they run, which as a business, this is a great idea, because you're able to really take and spend your money where you've already proved that it's actually going to work for you. Like we talked about in the beginning, that bigger picture idea, they're now able to make those advertising dollars work a lot harder for them. So some key takeaways to wrap today's session up. Correlation does not equal causation. Make sure that you remember those two biases that we talked about, audience bias and low rate bias. Start to examine and explore lift testing as a solution to overcome those challenges. But make sure that you're gaining alignment internally of what that means for your brand and what the benefit is going to be. And then implement those best practices that we talked about today. Make sure that you have a set goal that you're trying to achieve, isolating one independent and dependent variable, sizing up your experiment before you start to make sure you're set up for success, using technology that provides randomization, run your tests as close as you can to a real ad campaign, but most importantly, make sure you're taking the learnings that you get out of a lift test and actually implementing them to make sure that you are having your ad dollars work as hard as they possibly can to improve what you're getting incrementally. Thank you, guys. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions?
Just curious about the placebo ads.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so these are display ads that you're talking about. So you're talking about view-through conversions. What do the PSAs click through to, and like, how do you come up with those placebo ads?
That is a very good question. We can either use, if you partner with charities yourself, we can use the partner charity that you work with, or at Adobe, we also have a partnership program that we have more of a kind of library of charities that you can choose from, that you can source. So it's almost like a donation whenever you're running these type of experiments and using that, and it does click through to that charity's location, so they are going straight through to there. Any other questions? I think there was one over.
The worst at catching, so.
At least I'm not throwing it to you, so
Yeah,
there's benefit there. I would have missed
be here
you.
for a while. So I actually have like 100 questions, but I guess for when it comes to reevaluating the lift method or whatnot, how often are you doing that? Are you doing it weekly? And then once you get the customers that, you know, are, I guess, the best ones, how long are you using those customers for until they drop off and you have to redo it and figure out who the new audience is? I guess like the timeframes for both.
That is a very good question, and I'm going to try to give you a short answer, but it's
Okay.
actually a really
Yeah.
long one. But what you want to think about here is what you're testing and how consistent those type of audiences are going to be at play, right? So it's more of looking at things on a broader scale. In that example I gave, we were looking at customers that were lapsed, that they haven't rented movies in a while versus ones that just bounced from the cart recently. Those audiences are really easy to identify yes or no answers, what's good or bad. But it's really dependent on what you're testing, I would say. And you ask the question of how long do you have to run a lift test? That's part of that sizing opportunity, is we really estimate for you what's the amount of sample you need for the results to be statistically significant. Because what we don't want to do is get results and try to action off them if there's not significance, because it could just be happening by chance. So that really is part of that pre-campaign process, and estimating that sample is how long do we need to run the test to get results we can action off of. And then depending on what that variable is that you're testing, if it's audiences, we'd really want to take a look at what does that mean, and is there ability for those audiences to change? If there is, it's something that you might want to consider retesting and kind of iterating on and building on that specific test as time goes on, just to make sure those results stay consistent over time and that you're not missing out.
The placebo, what would be the difference if you just didn't run any ads to those audiences? Would there be a difference?
That's a good question. There's a couple different methodologies that you can take when you think about lift testing or a control group. One method would be a holdout method, which I think is what you're referring to, so not serving them any ad at all. That is a good method, and as long as there's randomization into how you're holding that group out, we actually have some other solutions at Adobe that allow you to do that. But the benefit of running an actual placebo ad is there is some variances, especially in digital, of people that are found online a lot. So we know, we've done a lot of tests around this too, is that if you end up delivering ads to people on the internet, but then just holding out a portion of that audience, it might be disproportionate to those people that you're actually finding on the internet. So by serving them a placebo ad, we know same audience, it's randomized, and they were found on the internet in the first place. Does that help answer your question? Yeah.
So obviously, like they were saying, if this is display ads, you're paying for each click. So, for a client or for your agency or whatever, if you have a really limited budget or, you're really keeping super close track of ROI, that sort of thing, how do you respond to people who say, I don't want to spend money on ads that I know aren't going to generate revenue, and that sort of thing?
I would say that's one of the biggest blockers for people running this type of tests, even though it's really the gold standard when it comes to digital measurement, is that cost of paying to run a charity ad versus your actual ad. What we do to help advertisers reduce those costs is we really help them estimate those sample sizes needed to get down to what % placebos we need to deliver that we feel we can reach significance with at the most economical cost. So that is a challenge that exists out there, but it's something that you kind of have to weigh the trade-offs whenever you enter there.
Still made me catch it. When we're talking specifically about like just display in this example, obviously like even just with Adobe, you guys work across a variety of channels. Can you talk a little bit about how the methodology sort of starts to shift as you think about omni-channel marketing and involving some of those other digital tactics or even other offline tactics?
Very good question. With digital, I use display a lot today as an example, but the technology that we use, at least, you are able to do this with anything that has a cookie or ID attached to it. So you're able to use that same technology and concept to do that. It gets a little trickier when you think about television, just because it's a little bit harder working on a household level to understand who's seeing the ad and not seeing the ad with this type of methodology. But as far as video or even things like, looking at video to display or certain tactics within the digital landscape, this type of method is really easy to implement. I say easy to implement, but the technology works easier than what it is in television. All right. Well, thank you guys. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me.